How do you house an army of millions scattered across frozen tundras and sweltering jungles when every inch of shipping space is priceless? Think about it. Men heading for the Aleutians one week and the Pacific Islands the next, supplies already crammed onto every ship and no time to build. Wood barracks are too bulky, tents rip and collapse. The problem isn't comfort, it's survival and the nation's ability to fight. In 1941, facing that impossible choice, America didn't answer with a fortress or a complex engineering marvel. It answered with something almost embarrassingly simple: a curved sheet of corrugated steel bolted into a hut that would change everything. By late 1941, the United States faced an unprecedented logistical crisis, not just how to move millions of men, but how to keep them alive once they reached the front. Troops were being funneled to every corner of the globe: Arctic outposts, jungle islands, bomb-scarred European beaches, and every ship, railcar, and pallet was already spoken for by guns, fuel, and ammunition. Ports were clogged, timetables were brutal, and planners raced against a ticking clock. Moving an army was one thing, housing it was another. The scale was staggering, and for many soldiers the stark reality remained: there was nowhere to live. They had nowhere to live. These men were being sent not only into gunfire, but into climates that could kill as surely as a bullet: Arctic gales off the Aleutians that cut through wool and bone, and the steaming, suffocating humidity of Pacific jungles that turned kit into rot and bodies into breeding grounds for disease. Exposure wasn't a comfort issue. It sapped strength, ruined equipment, and shredded morale. A soldier exhausted by cold or drenched by monsoon rains is a soldier who can't fight, mend a plane, or save a life. The housing problem wasn't a side concern, it was a threat to the entire war effort. At first, the instinct was old and obvious: build wooden barracks, the kind armies have used for generations. But instinct alone couldn't win a global war. Timber was heavy. Frames took skilled carpenters in days, even weeks, to raise. Every plank carved away precious cargo space on ships already stuffed with guns, ammo, and fuel. In short, wood would slow the whole machine, so planners had to look for something faster, lighter, and far more efficient. Tents were the obvious alternative: cheap, light, and easy to pile on a ship. But they proved fragile. Canvas tore in monsoons, poles snapped and frames collapsed under heavy snow, and rain pooled into mud patches that never dried. In hostile climates, a tent was barely a roof, a flimsy, temporary shield that left men exposed to storm, cold, and disease. This isn't just about comfort, it's a matter of strategic survival. When men freeze or bake, when rain soaks boots for days or mosquitoes carry fever into a unit, it's more than misery. It's a slow leaching of combat power. Slower reflexes, dulled judgment, shredded morale, and bodies too weak to carry a rifle or drag a wounded comrade. Exposure breeds illness, injuries deepen, and tiny problems balloon into mission-ending ones. A soldier weakened by the elements is a soldier who cannot fight effectively, and that vulnerability, left unchecked, ripples outward, threatening the entire chain of war. The entire chain of war, from the mechanic leaning over a blood-streaked engine to the surgeon in a field hospital, is at risk. Without solid shelter, tools freeze, wounds fester, and simple tasks turn deadly. Men soaked to the skin get sick, engines sit idle, supply lines clog. Morale unravels faster than bullets can be fired. In short, exposure isn't a comfort issue, it's an operational collapse. Lose shelter, and you lose readiness, medical care, even command and control. That vulnerability could cripple offensives and bleed the war effort dry, which is exactly why naval planners were already hunting for a better answer. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy saw the crisis coming like a storm on the horizon. They weren't waiting for catastrophe to force their hand. Planners ran the numbers: millions of troops, hostile climates, limited shipping space. The old answers, wooden barracks, canvas tents, wouldn't survive the scale or the weather. So the Navy began quietly hunting for a new kind of shelter: light, rugged, and stackable, something that could be mass-produced, crated flat, and assembled by untrained hands. It was an urgent, practical problem, and one that would push military engineers to throw out tradition and reinvent how you house an army. They pored over blueprints and old war relics. Most promising was the British Quonset Hut, a half-moon of corrugated steel that had sheltered troops in World War I. It was clever. It was proven. But every engineer on the Quonset Point team saw its limits. Fiddly rivets, awkward parts, designs not made for America's factories or the scale this war demanded. The Navy wanted shelter that could be stamped out, stacked flat, and thrown from a ship onto a beach by men who'd never built a building before. Better, stronger, simpler. The idea was no longer academic. It was a brief away from becoming an industrial order. The mission crystallized: design a go-anywhere, build-anywhere shelter. Not something pretty, not something bespoke. It had to be portable enough to fold into a ship's belly, tough enough to shrug off wind and rain, and simple enough to be stamped out by the tens of thousands. It had to arrive as a kit, packed flat, assembled by unskilled hands in a single day. It had to save shipping space and shave weeks off construction, two currencies the military couldn't afford to waste. In short, portable, durable, mass-producible. And it wasn't a future wish, it was needed yesterday, with the clock already screaming. So who takes the mission? A small team of engineers at the George A. Fuller Company, working out of the Navy Air Station at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. They're practical people builders, not theorists. And the clock is merciless. Troops are shipping now, winter is coming, and every inch of cargo counts. Their brief is brutal design, a shelter that packs flat, ships light, and can be raised by unskilled hands in a day. There's no time for elegance. Facing a deadline, the engineers tossed the ornate plans aside. What they needed was speed and repeatability, not flourishes. The answer was almost embarrassingly simple: an arched, half-cylinder shell, cut from corrugated steel, cheap, light, and strong. No fancy trusses, just curved panels that could be stacked flat and shipped by the thousands, ready to bolt onto a skeletal frame. Instead of a maze of studs and nails, they skinned that half-cylinder in sheets of corrugated steel, each panel drilled to line up with arched steel ribs. Bolt, repeat, bolt, until the shell became its own skeleton. The ribs carried the load. The skin kept the weather out. No heavy trusses, no complicated joinery. The whole unit simply sat on a basic wooden floor or a plain concrete slab, which meant you could pitch a building almost anywhere. Beach, tundra, jungle. It was honest, mechanical, and fast. A shelter you assembled like a piece of furniture, ready for the plywood end walls to follow. They finished the shell by slapping plywood onto the front and back, nothing fancy, just a simple door and two windows for light and ventilation. Small, functional cuts in a sheet of steel that made the place livable, easy to make, easy to replace, and built to the same spec every time. Little end panels that could be stacked flat and shipped with the rest of the kit. But the real stroke of genius wasn't the arch or the corrugation, it was thinking of the hut as a kit. Every panel, every rib, every bolt and window frame was standardized, stamped, and labeled so that dozens of identical parts could be packed flat, stacked tight, and counted like ammunition. Crates of steel sheets and numbered ribs slid into ship holds with surgical efficiency. Nothing wasted precious space. The pieces were small enough to be handled by a few men, simple enough to bolt together with basic tools, and obvious enough that an illustrated instruction sheet turned strangers into builders in a day, a tiny, modular factory for shelter. Because every panel, rib, and bolt packed flat, these huts turned ship cargo holds into Tetris boards of steel, dozens of Quonset kits stacked where a single wooden barrack would have taken the whole hold. Space that used to vanish under lumber and framing suddenly multiplied, letting convoys carry more men, more fuel, more firepower. And when they hit shore, those neatly packed pieces, with a simple instruction sheet, went up in a day. Every Quonset kit came with one thing as vital as the steel itself: an instruction packet. It wasn't a thick manual, just clear diagrams, numbered panels, and a parts list that matched every bolt and rib. Follow 3 simple steps and the hut took shape. A small crew of untrained men could assemble a complete building in a single day. That speed mattered. It meant forward units didn't wait for carpenters. It meant entire camps rose while ships still unloaded. It turned logistics from a bottleneck into an advantage and gave exhausted soldiers a shelter they could see go up before their eyes. By mid-1941, the first prototype went up at Quonset Point, a squat, 16 by 36 foot half-cylinder of corrugated steel, bolted to arched ribs and set on a simple wooden floor. It looked industrial, almost crude, no trim, no comfort, yet it went up fast, with a handful of men and basic tools. Not elegant, but exactly what they needed: shelter you could ship, assemble, and trust. It was a prototype, and now the real work testing began. Then came the tests, the moment a clever sketch became something you could bet a life on. Engineers hurled wind, rain, and simulated wear at that little half-cylinder, and it didn't just hold up. It shrugged off hurricane-force gusts like they were paper. It was shockingly light, each corrugated panel stacking flat so cargo holds groaned with dozens of kits where one wooden barracks might have gone. A handful of untrained hands could bolt ribs to skin and raise a shelter in a day. Practical, ruthless in its efficiency, and utterly unglamorous, it needed a name. The Navy christened it the Quonset Hut. It was a brilliant, almost miraculous fixlight, strong, cheap to ship, and shockingly quick to build. But when planners walked through the first rows of assembled huts, the celebrations hit a hard stop. The standard Quonset was simply too narrow. 16 feet felt roomy for bunks, but claustrophobic for a hospital ward, impractical for a mess hall, and impossible for many command and maintenance needs. That single dimension suddenly turned a triumph into a problem with consequences. Patients stacked like sardines, cooks fighting for kitchen space, crews unable to work on aircraft. The victory wasn't wrong, it was incomplete, and now the designers had to reinvent the hut to meet the war's bigger demands. It worked, and then it didn't. The first 16-foot Quonset was sturdy, simple, and shockingly fast to build, but planners soon hit a hard truth. That curved shell was too narrow for everything the war demanded. A squad could sleep in it comfortably. A hospital ward could not. A mess hall became crowded. A command post was cramped. That mismatch turned a clever prototype into a strategic problem. The hut had to scale up without losing the one thing that made it revolutionary: packed flat parts and idiot-proof assembly. So engineers had to rethink size on the fly and do it fast. They raced back to the drawing board. Engineers widened the curve first, a 20-foot model to breathe room into barracks and workshops, then a full-blown 40-foot version, a cavernous half-cylinder big enough to roll aircraft into for maintenance. The change was sudden and decisive. What started as a narrow shelter became a system, one design scaling up to meet every need the Army could throw at it. That shift to modular thinking did more than widen a roofline. It turned a single-purpose shelter into a full-blown building system. By swapping ribs, stretching panels, and stacking kits, the same basic parts could become a cramped barracks, a long hospital ward, a noisy mess hall, or a cavernous maintenance hangar. A 16-foot idea grew into 20 seconds, and 40 seconds without retooling factories. Standardized pieces meant faster packing, simpler shipping, and crews who could adapt a layout on the spot. In short, one design stopped being one thing and became whatever the war and the men on the ground urgently needed. As America reels from the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, any lingering debate vanishes overnight. What had been a clever prototype becomes an urgent necessity. Blueprints are finalized, contracts cut, and the Navy issues blanket orders for the wider, stronger Quonset designs. Kits are approved, stamped ship out now, and the race to turn steel sheets into shelter moves from drawing board to factory floor. The nation's industrial engine roared to life. Factories that had been tooling up for tanks, bombers, and ships retooled again. Presses, rollers, riveters, all tuned to a new urgent task: stamping out curved sheets of corrugated steel. Side by side with the great machines of war, assembly lines began churning Quonset Hut kits, ribs, panels, bolts, windows designed to stack flat and ship tight. Men and women worked in shifts. The same rush that forged aircraft now forged shelters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Every panel pressed, saved cargo space, and bought a soldier somewhere to sleep. The scale of production was staggering. Factories that had once forged battleships and bombers retooled entire floors to stamp out curved steel panels by the hour. Lines of workers, men and women on rotating shifts, fed sheets into rollers, bolted ribs were pressed and boxed, and instruction manuals slipped into crates the size of trunks. Everything was standardized, everything stackable. Where a single wooden barrack had been bulky and slow, these kits nested flat and multiplied like currency on a dock. It wasn't glamour, it was volume, speed, and ruthless efficiency, and before long, the Quonset Hut was being churned out on a scale the world had never seen. By 1945, over 150,000 complete kits had been built and shipped to every theater of war, from Europe to the Pacific. Imagine cargo holds crammed with flat steel ribs and corrugated panels, train cars, and Liberty ships loaded with nothing but boxes stamped Quonset, an industrial tide rolling around the globe. That number wasn't abstract. It meant whole villages appearing overnight. Seabees unloading crates on blasted beaches, depot yards converting farmland into barracks, medical wards and mess halls rising where none had stood before. In 4 years, a makeshift shelter became a global network of instant infrastructure, a logistical force multiplied by mass production. This is America's logistical superpower in action. While enemy forces often spent weeks digging elaborate caves or reinforcing concrete bunkers, American forces had a different strategy: move fast, ship light, and build on arrival. Mass-produced steel panels were stacked flat in cargo holds by the thousands, bolts and ribs packed like parts in a giant kit. Ports and airfields were flooded with crates that could be unloaded and assembled by a handful of Seabees in days, not weeks. The result wasn't permanence, it was immediacy. Whole towns of barracks, hospitals, and workshops rising overnight, ready to support the next push. Landing on a newly captured, war-torn island, Navy Seabees and Army engineers unpacked stacks of flat panels and bolts, and in days, not weeks, pieced together an instant town of steel barracks, workshops, radio huts, even crude roads and power lines, turning raw sand and jungle into a functioning base that could house, feed, and fix an army pushing farther into enemy territory. Suddenly, stripped beaches and soggy jungle clearings became humming towns. Quonset kits arrived, crews bolted them up, and in days barracks, field hospitals, mess halls, command centers stood ready to fight, heal, and feed. What had been hostile, unusable ground turned into the backbone of every campaign, a steel skeleton that let America move faster than any enemy could hope to stop. It wasn't a new gun that came to stand for American reach so much as a simple, arched shell of corrugated steel, tiny, stackable kits that factories spit out by the thousands, rode on convoys, and were bolted together by Seabees in a matter of days. Where once armies needed to build, dig, and wait, the Quonset Hut let America arrive ready-made, turning beaches into airfields and jungles into hospitals almost overnight. That image, not brute firepower, but the ability to carry shelter, medicine, and command across oceans, made the hut a shorthand for a different kind of dominance. Infrastructure as strategy, industry as weapon. For the soldiers on the ground, a crate of Quonset kits arriving on the beach was nothing short of a miracle, a sharp, tangible pivot from chaos to order. Men who'd been damp, sleepless, and exposed for weeks suddenly had something they could count on: a metal roof, a floor, a door that closed. They pried open boxes, passed out bolts, and read those laughably simple instructions like scripture. It wasn't luxury, it was shelter, stability, a place to stow a rifle and a letter home. Morale steadied. Commanders breathed easier. For a war that ran on logistics, the kits felt like hope in corrugated steel. After weeks or months in a muddy foxhole or a leaky tent, the solid arched roof of that steel hut feels like a palace. Suddenly, there's a dry floor under your boots, a real door that shuts out wind and rain, a nail to hang your jacket on tiny certainties that start to make the world make sense again. Men who smelled of mud and diesel laugh over a steaming pot in the corner. Cots get straightened. Letters to home are written by lantern light. For the first time in a long time, sleep comes without the constant fear of the sky collapsing. Still, it wasn't perfect. But were these steel huts truly the answer to every problem a soldier faced? At first glance, yes, they arrived fast, went up fast, and for men who'd slept in foxholes or soaked tents, a dry floor and a locked door felt miraculous. But the reality was messier. Corrugated steel screamed in rain, interiors baked under tropical sun and froze in European winters, and the bare shells often needed stoves, insulation, and elbow grease to be livable. They solved strategic shortages, not every human need. Still, even imperfect, noisy, and drafty, they offered shelter, routine, and a sliver of normalcy enough to matter. They were far from perfect. Rain on that corrugated roof wasn't a drizzle, it was a drumline, a constant hammering roar that turned a bunk into a battlefield against sleep. Men traded stories of nights spent awake, heads pressed to cots, swearing they could tell an approaching storm by the cadence on the metal. They improvised blankets hung, tarps nailed, stoves scavenged anything to dull the sound and steal a few hours of rest. But the noise was only the first insult. Beneath that clamor lay a more brutal truth about comfort, or the lack of it. They weren't just loud, they trapped the weather. In the Pacific, the corrugated skin turned every hut into an oven. Metal that drank the sun all day and radiated it back at night, cots steaming, men drenched in the thin sweat of exhaustion. In Europe, the same shell flipped sides. Uninsulated, it let cold slip through every seam, breath frosting in the dim light, boots crusted with ice. The fix was never immediate. Men scavenged stoves, piled sandbags and burlap, stuffed gaps with straw and mattresses, jury-rigged insulation from whatever they could find, desperate, inventive, bought time until proper heating arrived. They weren't luxurious. They leaked. They thundered in a storm. They baked in the sun and froze in the dark. But to a man coming in from foxholes and mud, they were home plain, steel-wrapped rooms that meant privacy, shelter, and a moment to breathe. Inside those arched shells, men carved out routines. A cot in the corner, a kettle on a scavenged stove, letters stacked on a crate, boots lined up like soldiers of a different order. That small, stubborn order mattered. It steadied nerves, mended frayed tempers, and gave a single clean fact to hold on to. Here, for now, you were safe. Inside, a soldier could finally hang their gear on a nail, line up their cot, and for a few precious hours feel a sense of order and permanence. It was a small domestic ritual: sweep the floor, set your boots by the bunk, fold a sweater that stitched a chaotic day into something like normal. The corrugated roof still thundered in storms, and the air could be oven hot or bone cold. But those minute routines made the metal hut feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a room you owned. They traded stories, boiled coffee, and wrote letters home. And for a moment, the war receded to the distance where it belonged. Back behind their corrugated walls, men found small rituals: cleaning boots, hanging a uniform on a nail, and then a quieter one: writing home. Pens scratched letters by dim lantern light, describing not frontline heroics but something almost miraculous. Metal towns rising overnight on beaches and bombed-out clearings, rows of curved roofs shining in rain and sun. They marveled at how quickly shelter became routine, how a palette of flat panels could turn chaos into order. Those letters carried relief across oceans, softening the fear of families back home and turning a technical achievement into a human story. And as the story spread, the hut's uses multiplied. Their versatility was unmatched, and they earned that reputation fast. One Quonset could sleep 30 men in neat rows of cots, footlockers at the foot, helmets hung on nails, a single oil stove hissing in the corner, turning cold, chaotic nights into something like routine. In another hour, the same shell might be stripped of bunks and filled with stretchers and surgical lamps, or lined with benches and a makeshift workshop bench. Everything was compact, efficient, and strangely domestic, a place to write a letter, to dry socks, to swap a story. And while one hut held sleeping men, the one next door would be doing something completely different. Next door, a hut thumped with the clatter of trays and the low roar of voices as men lined up for hot coffee and a real meal. A few yards down, another Quonset had been turned into a field hospital: bright lamps, antiseptic smell, stretchers, and surgeons moving in tight, efficient patterns, saving lives under that same curved steel. In the space of a beachhead, these little buildings became food, shelter, and medicine, a functioning town that arrived with the ships. They were adapted into everything: classrooms where rookies learned to tune engines and read maps, quiet chapels where men bowed their heads between patrols, and dim, makeshift movie theaters where a reel from home could turn a night into a brief, ordinary evening. Laughter, popcorn, the glow on tired faces. One hut might hold an exam, the next a Sunday service, the next a projector and folding chairs. Their simple arches swallowed noise and organized chaos, turning scattered squads into functioning communities. They weren't glamorous, but they were steady, practical, the backbone of military life, everywhere ready to be packed, shipped, and raised again at the next shore. The Quonset hut didn't stay put, it rolled with the flag, a low, silver line of shelter that appeared wherever American forces went, from frozen outposts to sun-baked islands. It wasn't glamorous, it was practical, and that practicality was its power. easy to ship, faster to raise than a sermon, and flexible enough to become a barracks, a clinic, a repair shop, or a church in a single afternoon. For troops who had lived in rain and mud, a metal roof meant order, warmth, a place to sleep without fear. In short, it proved itself in every theater of war, and the story was just beginning in the Pacific. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. After Marines seized islands like Guadalcanal, Quonset kits arrived flat, light, and maddeningly simple to erect. Within days, a battered shoreline became a functioning base. Barracks, workshops, radio rooms, and the crude hangars that let engineers patch, and armed planes so airfields could open and the next island-hopping strike roll forward. Speed, more than steel, won those battles. In Europe, after the D-Day landings, Quonset huts were stacked off landing craft and raised in hours command posts where officers plotted advances, supply depots that kept convoys moving, and makeshift hospitals where surgeons worked through the night. They turned shattered beaches into functioning bases, a simple steel skeleton for the push into France, fast, ruthless, and utterly indispensable. During the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, when snow piled waist-high and the wind felt like a blade, a heated Quonset hut could mean the difference between life and death. Men came in from the line numb, soaked, and deliriously exhausted. Inside, a single potbelly stove and a corrugated shell turned sheer cold into bearable warmth. Medics could dry clothes, treat frostbite, and revive shivering soldiers who would not have survived another night in a foxhole. It wasn't glamour, just metal, a fire, and cots, but that small refuge kept bodies intact and spirits steady enough to fight another day. They proved their mettle in every climate imaginable. In Alaska, the Quonset's curved roof wasn't just a shape, it was a lifesaver. Snow slid off like water. Instead of piling into a collapsing weight, fierce Arctic gusts wrapped around the ark, instead of battering flat walls. Inside, men who had known icy tents finally slept under a dry, wind-sheltered shell. Cots, stoves, and radios survived where flimsy shelters failed. That simple curve turned metal and bolts into a small, stubborn refuge against a landscape designed to break you, and it did its job, day after freezing day. From Arctic blizzards to Sahara glare, the Quonset's simple curve proved shockingly universal. In North Africa, their steel shells threw welcome shade against a searing sun, turning barren dunes into workable camps. In wind-whipped wastes, they kept out the worst of the weather. In humid islands, they offered the first dry floor and a place to sleep that didn't leak. They weren't glamorous, but they were everywhere, a practical answer to every climate the war could throw at them. By the time the shooting stopped, Quonset huts had been shipped to every continent on Earth, all but Antarctica. In 1945, the guns fell silent. The global war was over. For the Quonset hut, designed as nothing more than a temporary fix for an emergency, its job appeared finished. Battlefields quiet, supply lines clipped, the relentless demand for instant shelter evaporating overnight. What had once been a frontline miracle looked briefly like excess steel in depots and empty lots. Men who'd raced to bolt ribs together now wandered back to civilian life, and the huts that had hummed with purpose sat waiting, their curved roofs catching dust and rain. It felt like a tidy ending until the world realized rebuilding would need every tool available. But as one crisis ended, another began. Millions of battle-hardened GIs came home all at once, soldiers who'd been living out of foxholes, tents, and the new steel huts, walking into a country unprepared for them. Factories were retooling, rationing ended, but housing simply didn't exist at the scale needed. Whole neighborhoods were missing, construction crews were stretched thin, and returning families faced waiting lists and makeshift solutions. The demand was sudden, vast, and painfully personal. Young couples ready to start lives, veterans craving stability, yet the American dream of a front door and a backyard felt, for many, frustratingly out of reach. Millions of uniforms folded into suitcases, and they came home hungry for jobs, classrooms, and families, the GI Bill, promising the future they'd earned. But the map of America had no empty rooms. Cities swelled, rents jumped, waiting lists grew longer than anyone expected, and whole neighborhoods felt full to bursting. Young couples circled paperwork like weary soldiers circling a closed gate. Hope met a hard wall. After years of survival, these vets faced a new battle, finding a roof over their heads. That desperate need was about to run straight into a surprising surplus waiting in depots around the world. At the same time, the military sat on an unexpected treasure, tens of thousands of ready-made steel huts, stacked in depots from Norfolk to Okinawa. They weren't weapons or tanks. They were roofs, floors, rooms, waiting to be put to work. With millions of returning GIs and a domestic housing crisis growing by the day, the answer was glaring. Surplus was inventoried, stripped of military markings, and readied for sale or shipment. What had been a wartime stopgap could be turned into instant shelter, cheap, movable, and available right away. The fix, once obvious, moved from idea to action almost overnight. The wartime shelter began its second, and perhaps most surprising, life. Built as a blunt instrument of logistics, those corrugated shells that once hardened under bombardment suddenly looked less like military hardware and more like a quick answer to a very American problem. Millions of returning GIs and nowhere for them to live. Rows of kits sat in depots, rust-free and ready. University officials, town planners, and thrifty families all saw the same possibility. What had been designed to be temporary was repurposed into permanent barracks turned into bedrooms, field hospitals into classrooms, and the Quonset Hut quietly reinvented itself as a peacetime home. When the war ended and the GI Bill funneled millions into classrooms, universities were suddenly swamped and desperate for beds. They bought Quonset Huts by the thousands, cheap, flat-packed, and impossible to ignore, snapping up kits to turn parking lots and lawns into instant dormitory rows. What had been a battlefield shelter became campus infrastructure. Classrooms, mess halls, study rooms, all assembled overnight. For veterans, those corrugated shells were more than a roof. They were a fast pass to education, stability, and a new life. Universities bursting with new students on the GI Bill didn't hesitate. They bought Quonset Huts by the thousands and plunked them down in long, tidy rows. Campuses from coast to coast sprouted Quonset villages, or Vetsvilles, cheap, fast housing that turned desperate newcomers into neighborhoods overnight. Imagine cots and trunks, rationed furniture, shared mess halls and laundry lines, new marriages forged between classes, babies arriving where barracks once stood. They were crude, they were noisy, they were often cold and drafty. But they were a roof, a mailbox, a place to study and grow an entire generation, rebooting their lives under a corrugated arch. When the military auction doors opened, the Quonset Huts flowed into civilian life like a sudden, affordable flood. Sold by the thousands, they were cheap, flat-packed, and ready to be whatever a town needed. Whole neighborhoods rose overnight. Rows of steel arches became housing for young families, temporary classrooms for swamped colleges, and shelter for veterans chasing normalcy. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity. A hut could be a diner, a workshop, a church, anything. They stitched communities out of corrugated metal, turning the very symbol of wartime utility into the framework of post-war hope. In steel and screws, America built new lives. After the war, those corrugated shells turned up in the oddest, most American places. A neon-baked roadside diner serving pie at midnight. A whitewashed small-town church with a hand-painted sign. A one-screen movie theater showing Saturday matinees. A grease-streaked mechanic's shop. Even a barn stacked with hay and tractors. People cut openings, wired lights, hung curtains, and suddenly a military kit became a civic fixture, cheap, fast, and stubbornly useful. Not elegant, but honest. The curved roofs and steel ribs took whatever job was needed, and in that relentless adaptability, they helped rebuild everyday life, a trend that would spread far beyond our shores. Overseas, those same corrugated shells that had sheltered troops quietly slipped into civilian life, stapling themselves to the edges of shattered towns and turning blasted clearings into neighborhoods, markets, and classrooms. Men fixed windows, women strung clotheslines, children chased each other past makeshift shop fronts, and a clinic where once there had been only rubble. Locals painted and extended them, added porches and signs, and in places the steel huts became permanent hubs. Homes, schools, bakeries, a place to trade news and rebuild communities small, stubborn proofs that life could return. They weren't perfect, but they gave people a start. They were never glamorous. Critics were right. Thin steel meant poor insulation, rain on corrugation hammered like a drum. Summers turned them into ovens, and winters into teeth-chattering boxes until stoves and scrap insulation arrived. But strip away the complaints, and the truth is simple and stubborn. These huts did the one thing that mattered most in a world undone by war. They put a roof over a person's head. That roof gave privacy, order, a place to hang a uniform and write a letter home. It turned chaos into routine, fear into a flicker of comfort, and for thousands of people, soldiers, students, families, that flicker was everything. Today you can still spot them in the oddest places out past the cornfields, tucked behind a neon gas pump, or painted with the letters VFW on a small-town main street. Some wear a proud coat of fresh paint and a porch light. Others sag with rust and wild grass pushing through the floorboards. Inside, a converted diner hums with coffee and laughter. Down the road, a weathered hut holds boxes of memories for a mechanic or a farmer. They look both temporary and eternal. Plain, pragmatic, and oddly beautiful, these curved steel shells are the quiet, stubborn relics of a nation that once needed shelter more than anything. Each one stands as a quiet monument to a time when American ingenuity was put to the ultimate test. Rows of curved roofs peeking out of fields, a diner's neon sign reflected in corrugated metal, a VFW hall where veterans swap stories under a familiar arch. They bear rust and repairs, dents from hail and the odd patch job, but they still shelter people, memories, and stubborn routines. Built for urgency, they became stubbornly permanent, humble, practical, and oddly comforting. Look at them long enough, and you see more than metal. You see a country that solved an impossible logistical problem with a simple idea that kept people alive and moving forward. The legacy of the Quonset Hut is more than nostalgia. Its flat-pack kit, standardized panels, numbered ribs, bolts in a single crate, taught industry how to turn a building into cargo and cargo into a home. That lesson rippled out after the war. Universities and towns used surplus kits to solve housing crises. Entrepreneurs reimagined them as shops and churches, and architects borrowed their logic for mass-produced, affordable dwellings. Today, the prefab movement, emergency shelters, even the tiny house boom, all trace a line back to that simple half-cylinder. The Quonset proved that good design can be cheap, fast, and scalable, a house you can ship. Think of the Quonset as the great-grandfather of IKEA, proof that modular, flat-pack design could tackle huge social problems. Its corrugated panels stacked flat in a ship's hold. Its spare, idiot-proof instructions let untrained crews turn a beach into a town in days. That lesson standard parts, repeatable assembly, and brutal economies of scale did for shelter what assembly lines did for cars. Surplus huts became dorms, diners, churches, and whole neighborhoods, turning wartime excess into peacetime homes. The Quonset didn't just roof soldiers, it taught a generation how to solve housing shortages at scale, and today's prefab revival keeps going back to that same simple idea. Today, that wartime lesson still hums through architecture studios and planning meetings. The Quonset's genius wasn't glamour, it was economy. Standardized parts, flat-packed shipping, and a form that just works. Now designers are dusting off the half-cylinder, swapping wartime steel for recycled metal, adding modern insulation, and turning the kit idea into affordable, low-carbon homes, community centers, and pop-up clinics. Tiny home builders love the speed, planners love the low cost and resilience. It's not nostalgia so much as adaptation, a 50-year-old idea remade for a climate crisis and a housing crisis, proving simple, scalable solutions still matter. What started as a purely functional wartime cheat light, stackable panels bolted into an arch, has quietly been recast as a peacetime virtue. Efficiency married to honest durability. Architects and makers love the Quonset for the same reasons the Navy did. It ships flat, goes up fast, and outlasts what was supposed to be temporary. Today you'll find rehabbed huts as trendy studios, community centers, and eco-minded homes, their corrugated curves celebrated in design blogs and preservation shows. There's a satisfying irony here. Something built for throwaway expediency became a durable, beloved template for affordable, adaptable building in a world that suddenly needs both. It was meant to be disposable, a stopgap slapped together to shelter troops and supplies until the war called them elsewhere. But the math of its genius, cheap materials, standardized parts, and an almost stubborn usefulness kept it around. People found new purposes for a structure that was easy to move, cheap to buy, and impossible to ignore. Universities packed them with students, towns converted them into diners and churches, veterans turned them into houses and workshops. Over time, the corrugated steel and simple arch stopped being a temporary kit and started to mean something: thrift, resilience, and a peculiar, stubborn beauty. What began as a wartime expedient quietly became a cultural icon. The Quonset hut came to stand for both the raw hardship of war and the stubborn, hopeful work of rebuilding. It was the echo of rain on corrugated steel, the stove-warmed shelter after a freezing night, the cramped bunk where a soldier could fold his hands and write home. It was a makeshift classroom, a vet's dorm, a diner born from surplus panels, ugly, loud, imperfect, and utterly indispensable. Designed to be disposable, it refused to be forgotten. It reassembled families, campuses, and towns, turning wartime utility into peacetime lifelines. In short, it became proof that simple, practical design can carry people through crisis and into recovery. It stands shoulder to shoulder with the Jeep and the C-47 transport plane, unflashy, relentless workhorses that rarely make the history books, but without which the war simply couldn't have been won. A curved sheet of corrugated steel became a barracks, a hospital, a hangar, a mess hall. It sheltered the wounded, protected equipment, and gave exhausted men a place to sleep and to hope. While glamorous machines seized headlines, the Quonset Hut quietly kept the army functioning day after day, island after island. Its real victory was practical, turning raw industry into instant towns and steady lives. That humble usefulness is its lasting legacy. If there's one lesson the Quonset Hut leaves us with, it's this: the biggest, most lasting breakthroughs often wear the plainest faces. A bent sheet of corrugated steel, bolted together with a handful of parts, did more for millions of people than some clever, complicated plan ever could. It was fast to ship, simple to build, and designed around real human needs: shelter, warmth, a place to sleep, and write a letter home, not technical elegance. That humility is the point. Solutions that serve people beat cleverness for cleverness's sake. So look around. What small, overlooked idea could be the next Quonset Hut for our age?